lessons that we have taken from our history had their roots in 1939, 1940. In 1939, in August, the Nazis and the Soviets signed a treaty, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And in that treaty, they secretly divided up Eastern Europe. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and half of Poland were to go to the Soviets, and the other half of Poland to the Nazis. It was a secret protocol, but it was relatively well known back in the day that indeed the two totalitarian regimes had divided up Eastern Europe. And back then we were as small as we are today, so roughly 1 million people. And all of a sudden we look around us and we see the Nazis on one side, the Soviets on the other side, and no other allies to speak of. The Brits have their hands full with their affairs, the French likewise, the Americans are not engaged in European affairs. And then all of a sudden, according to the treaty, the Soviets present our government with an ultimatum. So we're asked to sign a treaty of friendship. These things are always called treaties of friendship. So somebody offers you to sign a treaty of friendship. Don't sign it. It's not friendship without it. According to the treaty, we're supposed to let in Soviet troops. And so the government understands what this is about. And they decide to sign the treaty. Our close neighbors and friends, people who basically speak the same language as we do, who are culturally very similar to the Finns, they make a different decision. So we end up fighting a war with the Soviets. We, however, let in Soviet bases. Doesn't take them long to take over the country, so we're occupied. The National Elite is murdered and deported to Siberia. Thousands of people escape. The reason why I'm down here in Florida is to celebrate our Independence Day on February 24th. So every February, Estonian communities all around the United States, they celebrate Independence Day. The reason why there is an Estonian community here is because of 1940. 1940, and then later on, during the following years, people escaped the country, the ones who can. If you were 18 years old in 1940, you were then drafted into the Red Army, illegally. You can't draft people into your army if you're occupying them. If you were 18 years old, you were drafted into the Red Army. 1941, the Germans arrive. They occupy Estonia. They keep drafting Estonian young men into the German armed forces. So if you were the younger brother of the person who was drafted a few years ago into the Red Army, you ended up being drafted into the German armed forces. So we ended up fighting the war. And we're not in our own uniforms. Unspeakable crimes committed on our soil against our people, against our other peoples. And then 50 years of brutal occupation. Brutal occupation. So when we talk about freedom, when we talk about liberty, rule of law, then in Estonia you can be certain that if you're talking to a person who's older than 25 years old, and that person remembers what it felt like when we had none of these things. So in 1991, we re-emerged on that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which we believe had a lot to do with our desire to be free again. The Soviet Union collapses, we re-emerge on the map of the world, and there are two lessons that people take away from 1939 and 1950. Two lessons that I think are very relevant for the Western world in general today, and that have been the reason why there is such consensus in our society around security policy. The first lesson is that not fighting is not the safer option. You know, you're a small guy, there's a major empire, totalitarian regime next to you. They threaten you with unspeakable acts, want you to sign a treaty, want you to give up. Never give up. Never give up. That is not the safer option. That is not the safer option. You always have to fight for what is right. You have to fight for your freedom. Freedom is not free, it's not going to be easy. But if you do not stand up for yourself, there's not going to be anybody else standing up for yourself. So in 1991, there is nothing in Estonia when it comes to defense. We're as poor as you can imagine. We still have Russian troops in the country, and yet we started rebuilding the armed forces, our National Guard equivalent, the military force. The defense expenditure is so low that when the newly elected Minister of Defense, who was a Swedish Estonian, grew up, lived in Sweden, he arrives in Estonia, he wants new furniture in his office, and he's told that he can't have And he thinks the bureaucracy is insulting him when they said we have no funds for it. And he went on and found out there actually there were no funds. That was the situation, there was nothing. And yet there was an understanding that we will not go quietly again. And that is one of the reasons why we have spent more than 2% of our GDP on defense, and have done that for years now, even before it became a fashionable thing to do. Lesson number 2 was that we are never to be alone again. Small nations cannot afford that. We are never to be alone again. So back in 1939, we look around us, the European security system has collapsed. The Soviets on one side, Nazis on the other side, no international organization to speak of, no alliance relationships that matter, and we end up in a bad place. Not just us. Europe tears itself apart. The world is torn apart. So we emerged in the lab in 1991 with a clear goal of rejoining the West, reintegrating ourselves into Western institutions as fast as we possibly can. Because the West, what is the West? It's a cultural term, political term. At the end of the day, if you're a country wanting to rejoin or re-cement yourself in the West, you need to join Western institutions. For us, that meant NATO and the European Union, primarily. And as a huge miracle, by 2002, less than 12 years after regaining independence, we received invitations to join the European Union. And in 2004, we indeed joined both of these organizations. The policy of joining everything continues. So we then go on to join the Eurozone, the Schengen area, the OECD. And by 2012, we became the most integrated nation in Europe. Later on, Latvia was going to join us. Not as an accident, but as a conscious policy of reintegrating ourselves, re-cementing ourselves into the West. So this is where we find ourselves in the early 21st century. And when you go back, read the texts, or talk to people who made policy, especially in the early 1990s, everything they dreamed about has come to life. NATO membership, EU membership. We're one of the most successful digital nations in the world. 99.8% of bank transactions online. People vote online. We do our taxes annually in less than 5 minutes. Huge success story. Economic one, as well as a political one. And one might ask whether this is the end of the speech or it's the end of the lecture, and whether we should now pack up and go home and congratulate ourselves. That's not, unfortunately, the case. It is dark, the clouds are gathering again. They have been gathering for quite some time. But I think they have become obvious to people who are far from the border areas of the West. The institutions we joined have never been as weak or under as much stress as they are today. Both domestic institutions as well as international institutions, NATO and the European Union, as well as other domestic institutions, the free press, the Catholic Church, we're discussing the all of these institutions under bigger stress today than they have been in the past. New challengers rising, great power politics is back. The American national security strategy, national defense strategy, make very clear. The U.S. now recognizes that Russia and China exist, and that they are not necessarily aggressively, but certainly directly confront the world order that the United States and the West built. In Russia's case, oftentimes also aggressively. 2008, the Russians invade Georgia. People think this is a one-off accident. A few years later, they invade Ukraine, annexed Crimea, and people are now recognizing that this is a pattern that needs to be dealt with. All of the challenges we thought would become 21st century challenges, international terrorism, problems that unfortunately come with globalization, uncontrolled migration. All of these challenges are still there and have not gotten much better. So we find ourselves in a situation where you can see all around us tension growing, more and more stress being put on institutions that keep us safe, and yet we in the Western world seem to be fighting amongst ourselves more than standing united against the challenges that we all confront, that confront all of us. From the perspective of a small country, that obviously is a problem. The situation we find ourselves today, in many ways, in the West, is schizophrenic. When you look at the substantive developments, what NATO has done, what the European Union has done, what the United States is doing, the developments have been good. It took us a while to wake up, but certainly after Crimea, people have recognized that great power politics is not a thing of the 19th century. So U.S. investments into European defense have gone up. European defense investments have gone up. The seriousness with which NATO deals with challenges we face, both in terms of Russia as well as international terrorism, unparalleled to what NATO did 5, 6, 10 years ago. The European Union is getting its act together when it comes to defense. One area where the European Union never played a role. Now the European Union increasingly playing a role in matters that relate to defense. Not in competition with NATO, because there is an understanding in Europe that European defense can only be handled jointly with the Americans. But there are ways where the European Union can play a huge role, helping the armed forces move around easily, building up infrastructure regularly, making defense industry more effective. And all of this is happening. So if you only look at the substantive developments, things are going in the right direction. Maybe not as fast as we'd like them to go, but they're still moving in the right direction. And then when you look at the headlines, or the speeches, or even the tweets that our leaders oftentimes, and our media reports, then you get a totally different picture of the situation. We criticize each other publicly. The Europeans criticize the Americans. The Americans criticize the Europeans. There is a rise of populism, on both sides of the Atlantic, that without considering the value of our alliances, throws out small sound bites that attack the very foundation of these relations. Insulting each other publicly probably is not the wisest policy, and yet when you look at that headlines, it seems as if the Atlantic Alliance is in crisis. This past weekend in Munich, European and American leaders gathered to discuss security policy at the Vilnius Security Conference. And the press coverage it received was unlike anything it has received before. It's a crisis in the transatlantic relationship. So this is where we are. We look at the substance, everything's going in the right direction. Headlines, not necessarily. We've been telling people, answering questions regarding this, telling people that pay no attention to these headlines. Pay no attention to the words. Look at what we are doing in substantive reality. And this is something that we've been saying as well. And this is true to a certain extent, because words matter. Words matter. And even if they do not necessarily correlate to what has been going on the ground, words have a tendency to change the developments on the ground. And we need to be much more careful with what we say to each other. The Russia challenge is going to get worse before it starts getting better. And even though in relative terms, Russia is a nation that is in strategic decline, the Russian leadership ought not to be underestimated. Russia is not a problem for Estonia. Yes, we're next door. Yes, we're small. But it was not our elections that we met them. People are not getting murdered by GRU agents on our streets. Russia is a challenge for the Western world in general. Why? Because they are threatened by us. Not because of what we do, but because of who we are. And for as long as there is a united West, a democratic united West, this regime in Russia feels itself threatened by us. So dividing Europe, breaking up the Transatlantic alliance, getting the Americans to leave European affairs has been a pretty open policy goal of the Russian leadership. Is there a room for dialogue? Of course. We should be talking to the Russians. We are talking to the Russians as the West. Is there room for compromise when it comes to these fundamental matters? No, of course not. We have no intention of going away. And I think the West can afford to be divided in face of all the challenges of the 21st century. So, what can I say? Things are pretty okay at the moment. The economy is growing all along the Western world, not as fast as it should in many parts of Europe. But there is relative peace and stability all around us. Globalization has made the world smaller. We can get the benefits of globalization, the unfortunate aspects of globalization reach us as well. In many ways, the world is similar to the world in the early 20th century. Just because things have not gone badly for quite some time does not mean that they will be okay in the future. It is going to depend on us to ensure that we have the institutions and the relationships to keep the world safe. And that is a task that will not go away in the next few years. You're a group that's interested in international affairs. My hope is that the future leaders of this as well as other countries amongst you, I'm absolutely certain that these challenges will continue for decades until one of you is Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, the President or Vice President, we will be confronted with the same issues. I hope that the people in these jobs today don't mess it up in ways that we will be able to fix. With this, I will conclude my opening remarks. I don't want to be as gloomy as I was. So, in contrast to the weather outside, so that would be pretty gloomy. But I'm more than happy to take your questions and answer anything that is of interest to you. Thank you.
So that's great, great timing, because it means we have at least 15 minutes for questions and answers, I'm sure. You mentioned a lot of things. I have questions as well, but I want to leave it, of course, first to our students. If you have a question, please, if you can raise your hand. And do we have a mic? Yeah, we do. So please introduce yourself for a second. And yeah, there's one question. We're getting to you, sir. Just give us a second. Oh, here. Good.
Hi, Ambassador. Thank you for coming. You mentioned that there's often a distance between what words are being said by leaders, what is actually happening on the ground. Obviously, President Trump has said certain things about NATO and how much the United States contributes compared to European nations. And I wanted to ask you, do you feel that those sentiments that he has are spreading down to the administrative level, or do you feel that it hasn't quite happened yet?
Well, first of all, I think President Trump is absolutely right. European defense expenditures have been lower than they should have been. The 2% goal was not invented by the Americans. It was something that was agreed upon by all the NATO allies. And that is necessary for the defense of this organization, this not organization. It's not as if you pay into NATO, it's what you pay for your own defense. It's just one of the parameters that we think is important. There are others, but the 2% one is, I guess, the most important one and the most famous one. So, President Trump is not the first American president to talk about that. He's not probably going to be the last American president to talk about that. He has been very successful in getting the message across. So, 5 years ago, people in Europe, outside the government circles that deal with defense policy, had no idea what 2% meant, what NATO defense expenditure goals were. Well, now they know. And I think it's largely because of President Trump. And I think we've seen positive movement because of that. European defense expenditures were increasing before he came into office, but they have been increasing faster since he made the 2% goal so famous. So I think he's absolutely right when it comes to that. Now, is NATO important for Europe? Absolutely. Europe cannot be defended militarily without NATO and without US participation. Is this a one-way street? No, it is not. And I'm most concerned about what is left unsaid. It is European allies that send not hundreds, not thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of soldiers to fight in American-led wars. Even the nations that get bad treatment by the press for not contributing enough deploy thousands of soldiers in harm's way. We had troops in Iraq. We were among the first ones to go in, among the last ones to come out, in Afghanistan, elsewhere, not because of Iraq or Afghanistan, not because we had some special intelligence on weapons of mass destruction. We had none. We went to Iraq and Afghanistan because the United States went into Iraq and Afghanistan. And that was the argument we made to our parliament and to our people. We've had people die in American-run wars. On a per capita basis, we have one of the highest number of losses from Afghanistan. Denmark is another one. The only reason why we fight in these wars with thousands of soldiers is because of the alliance to the United States. Because the United States was attacked from Afghanistan. Because the United States decided to go into Iraq. Not because of any other reason. And we also have troops in Africa because of the relationship we have with the French. Again, not because we have anything in Africa, but because we value the relationship with the French. This does not get reported on. No other ally anywhere in the world produces what Europe produces for the United States. So even if you want to forget about geopolitical arguments, even if you want to forget about all the US interests for a free Europe, a democratic and a US allied Europe, even if you want to discard all of these as 19th century mumbo jumbo, which it is not, by the way, but even if you want to do that, what the Europeans produce, what the Europeans bring to the table is uncomparable to anything else anybody else can do. And by the way, uncomparable to anything anybody else has ever done in the history for any other nation. So to say that the Europeans are not doing enough, yes, it is right when it comes to defense expenditures. But you will not mention that as we speak here today, there are European soldiers in American-run wars. I think it doesn't do, it isn't right. So, we Europeans we like to complain about ourselves. We're not very good at PR, but we should be better at telling this story. Secretary Mattis, I think it was him, he liked to say that he has, obviously, a long career as a military officer. He said that he has not fought a war without having allies by his side. I'm almost 100% certain that the allies he was talking about were Europeans. Every single time there's a war that the United States is engaged in, Europeans by their side. I think that, and this is not only a symbolic gesture. What we Estonians bring to the table may be symbolic because of our small size. It's not symbolic to the person that's killed, or his or her parents, or brothers, or children. Not symbolic to his friends. Well, all in all, we deploy a company to Afghanistan, a platoon to Iraq. And you could, again, make the argument that a platoon or a company is not going to win the war. Look at all the European contributions combined. It's not symbolic. Europeans led the bombing of Gaddafi. So, I think, you cannot build a defense on words alone. You need forces, you need infrastructure, you need treaties. So deterrence has many other components that are more important than the words you say. Yet you can destroy the deterrence posture with words alone, if you're not careful. So I think we need to take care of what we say about each other and how we say it. And even though we may be right on a factual basis, I think understanding how much answers matter to all of us is important. Sorry for the long answer. I haven't forgotten what the question was, but I hope that more or less talked about it.
Professor?
Any other questions? Other questions? Yep.
Based on everything you said, what do you see for the future of Estonia and its symbolic presence in the EU?
Estonia's future is going to be glorious. We're tremendous. The economy is growing. Even the population now is growing, interestingly enough. For I think the second year in a row, our population grew. There's people who left for mainly for economic reasons are now returning to Estonia. We are and will continue to be the leading technological innovator, not only in Europe but in the world. Estonian companies are now operating all over the world, in Silicon Valley, elsewhere. Skype, many of you probably use Skype, Estonian innovation. So I expect Estonia to grow bigger and bigger, even though physically we will continue to be a relatively small nation. The European Union, not only will it survive, it will be one of the most important cornerstones of stability in Europe. It is going through a difficult phase today, no question about it. Many are questioning the wiseness of Brussels bureaucrats, the famous bureaucrats somewhere else making all the decisions. As been the case before with international organizations or nation states or governments, there will be reforms. Some of them will be difficult. The Brexit process will continue to be difficult. But at the end of the day, the European Union will continue to be the cornerstone of European stability. Without it, I cannot imagine a stable Europe. And so will NATO. So all in all, I'm an optimist. And I'm mainly an optimist because I see people waking up to the challenges that we have, that confront us. Now, again, none of these problems will go away by itself. We tried that in 1939. We thought that if we just sat very quietly, we're a very peaceful country, in a very nice part of the world, beautiful nature, nice old towns, almost like this. No, not weather-wise, but otherwise. So who's going to bother us? We'll be quiet. And yet, history has a tendency of knocking on your door and waking you up in an awful way. So we ourselves are responsible for making sure this doesn't happen. And I'm optimistic mainly because I see people waking up, governments waking up. We were the only ones talking about some of the challenges a few years ago. I was stationed in Washington, D.C. at our embassy in 2007 when we had the first cyber attacks against Estonia, the attacks that made cyber famous. The now former U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice spoke at a conference in Ukraine a few months ago, and she said that for her, and remember she was the Secretary of State, for her the eye-opener when it comes to cybersecurity was when then President of Estonia, Toomas Ilves, called her and briefed her in 2007 on what was happening in Estonia. I arranged that phone call. It took me weeks to arrange it. It wasn't an easy thing to do, because people had no idea what cyber attacks were. They had seen it on sci-fi movies, and they thought this is some high-tech thing affecting intelligence agencies. No, that's not what happened to us. Nothing happened to our intelligence agencies. Nothing happened to the military. Banks' websites, news channels, newspapers' websites, those were the ones that went down. The ones that people use. How often are you using intelligence agencies' databases? Not very often, probably. So they attack the things that you use. And, that was a wake-up call back in 2007. Now everybody's talking about cybersecurity. That Russia is a challenge, now everybody's talking about that. Even the official documents. A few years ago, it was impossible to arrange an event in DC that would deal with NATO for European security or transatlantic relations and get more than 5 people in the audience. 4 or 5 years ago, it was impossible to talk about those things on the Hill with members of Congress or senators. And now you hold an event on NATO and it's packed. Not just the same 5 people. The same 5 people will come again, but there are 100 other people there. And there's unprecedented support for NATO, transatlantic relations, Europe, on the Hill, both in the Senate amongst the Republicans and the Democrats, as well as on the House side, bipartisan. So I think we're waking up. My hope is that we're not too late.
Hi. I just was wondering, in regards to Russia, would you believe that there might be further aggression in Eastern Europe by Russia, especially regarding the Ukraine? And if there is, what should be kind of the red line for NATO for intervention?
Red line for NATO is pretty clear. The red line for NATO is our eastern border, as well as any Latvians and Lithuanians and whoever is neighboring Russia. That's the red line. When I was at the Ministry of Defense, I like to take my international guests, those who have time, to our border. There's a bridge that connects us to Russia. In the middle of the bridge, there is the red line. It's actually gray, by the way. That's the red line. That's where the West begins. And that is also the line, we cross that line and we will fight. We will fight. And we won't fight alone. And the way we view our security is that everything we do is aimed at avoiding that war. The last thing that we want is military conflict in Europe. We're too small for that. We know the price of that. So everything we do is aimed at convincing every other decision maker that war is not worth it. We are absolutely certain that we are not to provoke the Russians. And we are also absolutely certain that the most provocative thing we can possibly do is demonstrate weakness or lack of resolve. So we want to make sure that everybody understands where the red line is and what the consequences of crossing the red line will be. In the Baltics, our defense stands on basically 3 pillars. Number 1, our own defense forces. The goal of our defense forces is to convince everybody that we will fight from the first meter or inch. And there's no questioning that. The second pillar is allied presence on our territory. So we have allied forces in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and other frontline states today. And they're fully integrated into our defense forces. In Estonia's case, the majority of those forces come from the United Kingdom. In Latvia's case, they come from Canada, and Lithuania's from Germany. In Poland's from the United States. The goal of these forces is to convince the other side, when they cross the border, or if they cross the border. Once our forces start fighting, and they start fighting back, the people they are hitting could very well be Estonians. But they could also very well be Brits, or Americans, or Germans. So the aim of allied presence is to convince everybody that we will never be alone again. And the third pillar is the ability of NATO to rapidly reinforce all of its allies. And that's the most important one, the least talked about one, because it happens to be the most complicated one. It requires military planning, infrastructure, things that are not easily wrapped up in a talking point or in a headline, and yet are very nuanced and important at the same time. So what could happen? Will the Russians, Russia will stop where we stop them. If we're, the West. The message that we are sending today with sanctions is, I think, resonating. The Russian leadership understands that what they did in Crimea and continue doing in eastern Ukraine was not without consequences. Have the sanctions worked well enough? Well, we'll see. Probably not yet. Should we take a step back? No, absolutely not, because that would be the most provocative thing for us to do. Will the Russians stop with Ukraine? I'm not sure. I'm not the right person to answer. But can we take a risk? No, we cannot. So defending and strengthening NATO, making sure that our messages are as clear as they possibly can, punishing Russia for malign activities, attributing attacks that they conduct, publishing them. I think these are the things that we have been doing in the past few years. These are the exact right things to do, and hopefully we'll convince them not to continue.
We have time for one last question. If not, then can I get a question?
Sure.
Thank you. And so, as somebody who teaches European politics, really the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they always sort of, what is the best outcome, right? That possible outcomes of, post-communist consolidation and transformation of Central and Eastern Europe. Now, it's not necessarily both economic as well as political terms, right? But that's not necessarily the case. You could look at Hungary, right, with this sort of semi-authoritarian government, Poland, which has its rule of law issues, Bulgaria, Romania, which have also, some problems, particularly when it comes to corruption, rule of law issues again. What makes the Baltic states and Estonia so successful? Is it a small size? Is it the fact that you're halfway Scandinavian? Or how can you use sort of your leverage that you have to kind of work with, I don't know, the Visegrad countries or other countries in the region to kind of, don't fall into sort of easy sort of, Western Europe, Europe is bad, and like the Russia is bad as well, and we have to, follow our own determined national.
Right. So that's a very good question. I don't know the answer to it. What I can say though is that there is no such thing as Baltic states. We're different. There are many similarities, partly because of 20th century history. But other than that, we don't form a single nation. And further, there is no such thing as Eastern Europe. And the area that we call Eastern Europe today, first of all, this is a political term, not a geographical. Vienna is further east than Prague is. So this political term is only used because of 20th century history and what happened after the end of the Second World War and where the Iron Curtain came down. So you could say that Eastern Europe today is Eastern Europe because that's the area where the Americans didn't get to. And Western Europe is Western Europe only because the Americans liberated Western Europe and Westerners didn't have the joy, quotation marks, of welcoming Soviet liberators. My point is that there is no such thing as an Eastern European mindset, an Eastern European politics. We're different. And as Estonian ambassador, I really don't know. And even if I wanted to, I couldn't speak on behalf of Hungary or Poland. I really don't know. I can speak on behalf of Estonia. You mentioned Scandinavia, and you're absolutely right. Scandinavia is so great because it's part Estonian or half Estonian, not the other way around. We're aware of the fact that what has happened in our nation in the past 30 years has been close to a miracle. More political scientists should look at the case of Estonia, or that of Latvia, or that of Lithuania. Because increasingly, as we are losing steam in the democratization process in many other parts of the world, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are continue to be one of the best examples of rapid turnaround. I think this success has a flip side, where we in the West in general looked at what happened in the Baltic states and thought that the same would happen everywhere else. We grew so accustomed to success that when we went into other places and didn't see rapid success, we grew disillusioned. And that is because miracles don't happen everywhere all the time. But part of the reason why we've been so successful is that we knew exactly where we were headed. We knew exactly where we had, what we had missed out on. And we simply wanted to get back to where we always thought we were supposed to be. So for all those political scientists who argue that identity doesn't matter, history doesn't matter, I always ask them to look at the case of the Baltic states and compare us to the cases that can be found around us or elsewhere in the world. I think identity does matter. And we truly were taken from the West, 50 years captive nations, and now we're free again. So it's only natural that we move that way. Can we provide lessons for other similar cases? To a certain extent, yes. But I think one needs to be very cautious at simply taking one's lessons and applying them up directly elsewhere. We do talk to many others in the region and elsewhere, and we have a lot of credibility because of our Soviet occupation past. So we try to spread the word as much as we can. The founding blocks, or the core elements of building a just and free society are the exact same ones where the American Revolution took place. Rule of law, checks and balances, a free press. If you compromise on any of those, then the outcome is not going to be democracy.